Music to hear, why hear'st thou music sadly? Sweets with sweets war not, joy delights in joy. Why lov'st thou that which thou receiv'st not gladly, or else receiv'st with pleasure thine annoy? If the true concord of well-tuned sounds by unions married do offend thine ear, they do but sweetly chide thee, who confounds in singleness the parts that thou shouldst bear. Mark how one string, sweet husband to another, strikes each in each by mutual ordering, resembling sire and child and happy mother, who all in one pleasing note do sing, whose speechless song, being many, seeming one, sings this to thee: thou single wilt prove none.
What is Shakespeare saying here? Simply that it isn't good to be alone? There's a hardness in these last words, thou, single, wilt prove none, which is in stark contrast to the opening lines. Music to hear, why hear'st thou music sadly? The regret in this searching question, the softness of the words, the inversion of music to hear into hear'st thou music, are all a long way from that final rebuke. What can such an admonishment have to do with music? The cycle contains one other sonnet about music, number 128. When thou my music, music playest. At first hearing, it is very close to why hear'st thou music. But there is a real difference. Our sonnet is addressed to a young man, the other to a woman. Thou my music is how he begins to her. To him he begins music to hear. She is music and plays an instrument. He cannot even listen aright. This is not mere metaphor. Shakespeare is taking us here to the heart of the Elizabethan vision of personal harmony. This vision was not vague, but scientific and rooted in ancient philosophy. Pythagoras, hearing the notes given off by blacksmiths' anvils, discovered that music was in the metal. Take a shorter piece of metal and you've got a higher note. It was this succession of notes which he called harmony, and groups of notes came to be called scales or modes. Plato gave these modes moral qualities, condemning those that were violent and extolling those that were calm. Cicero showed the Elizabethans where these notes originate, in his book, The Dream of Scipio, which in 1497 had become widely available in print. The notes come from heaven, brought into being by the planets rotating together in 8 concentric circles. As they spin through the sky, so they give off perfect tones, each of which bears a proportionate relation to the other. And as these tones also exist within gut, wood, and metal, animal, vegetable, and mineral, it was natural for man to bring them together in musical instruments. By playing them, and by singing and dancing, people themselves could become like the universe, proportionate and harmonious. This is the Dark Lady's quality, and it makes her in every sense the woman to Shakespeare's man. He longs to kiss the soft underparts of her hands as they unite with the keys to animate the jacks of the instrument. This desire is music too. The pair of them are a harmony, and there is laughter between them. The young man is a man of parts, a true Renaissance man. Yet he refuses to hear either the music around him or the music within himself. He will not have children, even though his whole nature and circumstance should demand it. To be against himself is the supreme disharmony. If the true concord of well-tuned sounds by unions married do offend thine ear, they do but sweetly chide thee, who confounds in singleness the parts that thou shouldst bear. The totality is denied you. Everything has a sum of parts. The man has a sum of his organs, senses, spirit, mind. Mark how one string, sweet husband to another, strikes each in each by mutual ordering, resembling sire and child and happy mother, who all in one pleasing note do sing. On a lute, which was the standard Elizabethan instrument, the strings are tuned in pairs. Only one is struck for the most part. The other vibrates in sympathy. But also, the construction of the instrument makes it highly resonant, and all the strings are set alive by one note. This resonance has its hierarchy, from low notes to high, each one fitting into the whole sound, which is the complete instrument. So it is with the family, whose own music sings the undeniable truth: you alone are none, as one string alone is not music. For the confirmed loner, it is a chilling thought. Ulysses in Troilus and Cressida reminds us of the consequences of such straying from the musical path. Take but degree away, untune that string, and hark, what discord follows. The final feature of this sonnet is the repeated use of one sound. Listen how the rhythmic stress falls on the word string and chimes through to the end. Ordering, resembling, pleasing, sing, then for variety, song, then back to being, seeming, sings, until the last thought, thou, single. That assonance should lead our intellect is only natural. It is what Shakespeare is trying to do to the young man. His music, which is there to be heard, will only be heard when he becomes part of the instrument, a family.
Music to hear, why hearest thou music sadly? Sweets with sweets war not, joy delights in joy. Why lovest thou that which thou receivest not gladly, or else receivest with pleasure thine annoy? If the true concord of well-tuned sounds by unions married do offend thine ear, they do but sweetly chide thee, who confounds in singleness the parts that thou shouldst bear. Mark how one string, sweet husband to another, strikes each in each by mutual ordering, resembling sire and child and happy mother, who all in one pleasing note do sing, whose speechless song, being many, seeming one, sings this to thee: thou single wilt prove none.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee.
It has long embarrassed English-speaking scholars that some of the most tender erotic poems in the language are addressed by an older man to a beardless boy, admired because his beauty is scarcely distinguishable from that of a girl. Such scholars are not troubled by the Hellenistic statues reproduced still as late as the Renaissance, which feature images of transsexual beauty. Naked and recumbent, these figures reveal luscious and apparently female flanks and buttocks, even as they conceal an ambiguous, almost irrelevant penis. But professors of literature are disturbed by the hermaphroditic poems of Shakespeare, whom they have declared the greatest English poet, and whom they therefore require their students to study not just for aesthetic reasons, but as a source of ethical inspiration. To be sure, pederasty is not unknown in Anglo-Saxon academic circles. Some indeed would contend that the homosexual eros was, until the coming of coeducation, the motive power of the British university. But until recently, it has seldom been defended as the highest expression of human love. Consequently, once the pedagogues could no longer ignore the sonnets, they sought to euphemize them. In 1640, when after 3 decades of neglect, John Benson reprinted the entire sequence, he changed certain giveaway he's to she's, so that even the most ardent poems seemed properly heterosexual. Though such trifling with the text seems reprehensible to modern scholars, they have swathed it in genteel commentary, denying it any biographical significance. After all, modern scholarship was created in opposition to Romanticism and the autobiographical heresy, which had led Wordsworth, for instance, to assert that the sonnets were the key by which Shakespeare unlocked his heart. And it utterly rejected the suggestion of a flagrantly gay poet like Oscar Wilde that the sentiment at their center was the love which dare not speak its name. Still, the scholars were equally appalled that the young men in their classes read sonnets like this one to girls they aspired to seduce or marry. Hypocritically, they argued that such verses should not be responded to passionately, but only for their literary quality. When I worked on these equivocal poems in college, I was told to read Sir Sidney Lee, who had presumably allayed all doubts about Shakespeare's sexuality by proving that the sonnets are purely conventional literary exercises without biographical significance. To determine for myself just how conventional Shakespeare's most private and personal poems were, I slugged my way through other sonnet sequences going back to Petrarch, but concentrating on the 1590s when the sonnet form was all the rage. And it soon became apparent how unconventional Shakespeare's sonnets are. Even those passages in which he seemed to echo his predecessors, the final couplet of this poem, for instance, with its promise of immortalizing his beloved in verse, were transformed by the passion that prompted them into something unique. But it was the plot which I soon discovered was truly original, since in every other sonnet sequence I'd read, the object of the poet's love was a woman fair and beautiful. And this, I learned, was only to be expected, since the sonnet form itself was from the start totally identified with the cult of courtly love, which envisages the love of woman as a kind of secular salvation preferred to the eternal bliss of Christian heaven. Only Shakespeare dared suggest that such redemption can be found in the purified love of male for male, and only he incarnates that love in the youth whom he typically addresses as thou, a genderless pronoun easily adaptable for heterosexual purposes. The maleness of the beloved, however, makes him possessible only in a marriage of true minds, whose consummation is not in the flesh but in print. In addition, the beloved is also unattainable because of the difference in class and age, being a lordling who responds with love undercut by a cool, aristocratic condescension. Finally, the beloved boy is fickle, destined to break his lover's heart. It is as the poet's most threatening rival for the boy's affection that a woman enters the plot, that infamous dark lady whom the poet has also desired and possessed. What he has felt for her, however, even before the double betrayal, is not really love, only a lust scarcely distinguishable from revulsion, which is to say, everything sublimated out of his pure passion for the boy. And he writes to her, therefore, a series of anti-love poems whose misogyny dismays Shakespeare's genteel critics even more than his homoeroticism. Of all Elizabethan poets, Shakespeare was the most immune to the cult of the Virgin Queen, convinced of what King Lear cries of women in his madness, they are all centaurs from the waist down. Even as the poet compares the beloved male with birdsong and summertime, and especially the sun, he is driven to assert that the dark lady whom anyone can possess and he, alas, cannot resist, is nothing like the sun in all the multiple meanings of that word. Yet the sequence which begins by insisting on the possibility of love between men transcending the flesh knows that once women have entered the scene, the sincerest male bonding is in peril. We cannot cross the cause why we are born, Shakespeare tells us in Love's Labour's Lost, and the melancholy burden of the sonnets is finally the same. There are, however, two ways of accommodating to that grim necessity, in a whore's bed or on the nuptial couch, and if the sonnets end with the former, they begin with the hope of the latter. Indeed, the opening sequence of poems urges the beloved to marry and beget a son in his likeness. Cynicism tempts us to remark that only thus can the pederast's sublimated passion be renewed after time has ravaged his love's pristine image. But more than this, the plea to beget provides the poet with an occasion for cataloging lingeringly and lovingly the evanescent beauty of the boy, which even as he writes, fades like the fading summer, and us who read.
Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed, and every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe or eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Let those who are in favour with their stars of public honour and proud titles boast, whilst I, whom fortune of such triumph bars, unlooked for, joy in that I honour most. Great princes' favourites their fair leaves spread, but as the marigold at the sun's eye, and in themselves their pride lies buried, for At a frown, they, in their glory, die. The painful warrior, famous for fight, after 1,000 victories, once foiled, is from the book of honor razed quite, and all the rest forgot for which he toiled. Then happy I that love and am beloved, where I may not remove nor be removed.
There are very few specific references in the sonnets to Shakespeare's contemporaries, except for his patron, the rival poet, and the Dark Lady. But here we do have one. Who was this great prince's favourite, whose favour is but as a marigold in the sun's eye, whose glory dies at a frown? The next lines offer us the vital clues. The painful warrior famoused for fight, after 1,000 victories once foiled, is from the book of honour razed quite. As the sonnets were written between 1592 and 5, this can only refer to the most reverberating fall in 1592 of Queen Elizabeth's great favourite, Sir Walter Raleigh, who lived here at Sherborne. The painful warrior is the giveaway phrase, for in Elizabethan English painful meant painstaking, and Raleigh was well known for his energy and industry. Indeed, at the very moment when Shakespeare was writing this sonnet, and Raleigh was languishing in the Tower, Sir Robert Cecil, the Queen's minister, was pleading for his release on the ground that he can toil terribly. He wanted him freed from the Tower to go down to the West Country to supervise the unlading of the rich booty from the East Indian carrack, the Madre de Dios, captured by Raleigh's own ships off the Azores. And it was as a warrior that this all-round Renaissance man, poet, historian, and chemist, was chiefly known. It was his campaigns in Ireland that had first brought him to the Queen's attention, and thereafter he was to fight at sea as well as gain a name for himself as a colonizer. He has left memorials to himself, not only in many place names, like Raleigh, the capital of North Carolina, but even in brands of cigarettes, for he was notorious as the patron of tobacco and is credited with introducing the potato into Ireland. These lines contain one further clue as well. After 1,000 victories once foiled echoes Raleigh's own words in prison as he bewailed to Cecil that once amiss hath bereaved me of all. This was the kind of court gossip that Shakespeare could easily have gathered through his patron, the Earl of Southampton. But what had Raleigh done to bring about his fall? Handsome and intelligent, he had sustained the precarious position of the Queen's favourite for 12 years when, while still writing love poems to that maiden lady and protesting his entire devotion to her, he was seducing her lady-in-waiting, Elizabeth Throckmorton. As captain of the Queen's Guard, he was supposed to be protecting the honour of those frail young ladies. What doubled his offence was that when she proved pregnant, he entered into a secret marriage, which he then denied, the details of the story remaining unknown until I discovered it in the diary of the lady's brother, Sir Arthur Throckmorton. A son was born, not hitherto known to history, evidently died young, baptized by the name of de Amory, of royal descent, so like Raleigh. Still more brazenly, Lady Raleigh went back to wait as Miss Throckmorton on the Queen, who did not put up with that sort of insult. She sent the couple straight off to the Tower of London. This is the situation described in the sonnet, the suddenness of the fall from grace, in spite of all the services rendered, as Raleigh himself pleaded, both on battlefields, on land, and at sea. Raleigh's fall must have pleased a lot of people, for his ascent had been too rapid and people were envious. Born of an ancient West Country family which had come down in the world, he was proud and arrogant, conscious of his gifts and abilities. Also a hard worker with immense energy. On his sea voyages it was noted as exceptional that he always carried a chest full of books. An Oxford man, for a time a student at the Inner Temple, he was well educated. This erudition and eloquence, acquired during these years, gained him the Queen's ear. She loved to hear him talk. Raleigh's great ambition was to retrieve the family fortune, and being Elizabeth's favourite was the right way to go about it. She not only granted him lucrative monopolies and export licenses, but a year before his fall gave him this grand estate of Sherborne in Dorset. Here, the old castle, now in ruins, was already in disrepair, and with characteristic energy he set about repairing it for a family home before having a better idea, and building this new, up-to-date mansion with gardens and waterworks laid out by his scientific half-brother, Adrian Gilbert. But Raleigh's other great ambition was to found a family. And how was he to do that when his whole favour with the Queen depended on his single-minded devotion to her and remaining unmarried? And so the crash came. Against this background, this recognisably truth-telling sonnet serves to remind us how real the idea of fickle fate was to men whose lives depended entirely on patronage, as Shakespeare's did on the Earl of Southampton during these years. So did Raleigh's on the Virgin Queen and on her successor James, who 16 years later took off the head of this proud Renaissance man, who is from the Book of Honour razed quite, and all the rest forgot for which he toiled.
Let those who are in favour with their stars of public honour and proud titles boast, whilst I, whom fortune of such triumph bars, unlooked for, joy in that I honour most. Great princes' favourites, their fair leaves spread but as the marigold at the sun's eye, and in themselves their pride lies buried, for at a frown they in their glory die. The painful warrior, famoused for fight, after 1,000 victories once foiled, is from the Book of Honour razed quite, and all the rest forgot for which he toiled. Then happy I that love and am beloved, where I may not remove nor be removed.
No more be grieved at that which thou hast done. Roses have thorns and silver fountains mud. Clouds and eclipses stain both moon and sun, and loathsome canker lives in sweetest bud. All men make faults, and even I in this, authorizing thy trespass with compare, myself corrupting, salving thy amiss, excusing thy sins more than thy sins are. For to thy sensual fault I bring in sense. Thy adverse party is thy advocate, and 'gainst myself a lawful plea commence. Such civil war is in my love and hate, that I an accessory needs must be to that sweet thief which sourly robs from me.
I did not read the sonnets until I was in my 20s. But I do remember that I was so struck by the 35th that I wanted to use a phrase from it as title to a book of short stories, Clouds and Eclipses. But since my publishers feared that I might be thought an aspiring meteorologist, I chose from Measure for Measure the somewhat minatory title, A Thirsty Evil. If nothing else, we had lovely titles then. 30 years ago, there was much discussion of Shakespeare's sexual life. By and large, those with vested, that is, tenured interests, maintained that although he was indeed enamored of the young man in the sonnets, that nothing of a sexual nature could ever have occurred because, as one famous scholar told me, Shakespeare was a very great genius who could never have understood so well the human heart had he ever done anything so viciously pathological as make love to another male. This is the way that scholars actually reasoned in those dark days. Naturally, none is now so blinkered to the facts of our estate. Whether or not Shakespeare ever had carnal knowledge of a man, or even of a woman, is forever moot. As they used to ask in the glorious days of Richard Nixon's Watergate, where is the smoking revolver? In Shakespeare's case, there is none. We do not know for certain what, if anything, he ever did of a sexual nature. The children that are alleged to be his could have been some other man's, conceived perhaps in the family's second best bed. Nevertheless, common sense, I think, requires that we accept it as likely that he fathered at least the 3 children that bore his name. Common sense also requires, on a close reading of Sonnet 35, that there was a sexual encounter between the older poet and the younger man, sometimes known as W.H. The sonnet's first quatrain seems to me to be quite clear. A sexual act has taken place between the 2 men, and whatever was done for the first time. The older poet suggests that the young man not fuss. No more be grieved at that which thou hast done. Roses have thorns and silver fountains mud. Exactly what transpired I will leave to the Warden of All Souls to work out, as he did so magisterially in the case of Connie Chatterley and Mellors amongst those Lawrencean spring flowers. But Shakespeare's images suggest that anal intercourse has taken place, and the young man is now being adjured by the poet to stop grieving over what has been done. The act of love is the highest human sentiment made flesh, but things can go wrong. The rose of love has its thorns, pricks, prick, silver fountains spring from mud. The splendors of the moon and sun are in their natural courses obscured from time to time by clouds and eclipses, while that loathsome canker that lives in sweetest bud clearly refers to those diseases associated with the goddess of love. To glace yet again that aged chestnut, venereal disease was epidemic in the Renaissance, just as it was, as far as we know, unknown to Shakespeare's master as a love lyricist, Ovid. For Ovid, the sexual act is just what it is and no more. Something simple and splendid in a way that it could not be to Shakespeare or to any writer born between the introduction of the pox into Europe and the invention of penicillin in our own time. In the second quatrain, the poet excuses himself for letting things get out of hand. All men make faults, and even I in this, authorizing thy trespass with compare, myself corrupting, salving thy amiss, excusing thy sins more than thy sins are. The phrase solving thy amiss presents a problem, if not a mystery. To Shakespeare, the verb to solve meant to construct a sort of Einsteinian unified field theory that would make sense of the movements of the heavenly bodies. So we're now back at the sun and the moon of the beginning. The word amiss can mean off the mark, or to fall short of one's goal, or to be out of order. So could it be that the poet, in his enthusiasm during the act, tried to make successful two heavenly, as it were, bodies in their faulty joining, corrupting or defiling himself in the process, and now excusing the sins of the other more than they really are, since he himself is collusive? The last quatrain plays even further with legal imagery. For to thy sensual fault I bring incense. Thy adverse party is thy advocate, and 'gainst myself a lawful plea commence. Here Shakespeare plays with the phrase incense and the word incense. He brings incense through his most sensible body, a perception of the other's fault, or he just brings incense as to a religious ceremony. Or most likely of all, he brings incense in the sense that he is all aflame with lust for the other. Whatever the poet holds himself guilty to, and thus will charge himself. The quatrain's last line connects somewhat messily, not with the quatrain, but with the final couplet. Such civil war is in my love and hate, that I an accessory needs must be to that sweet thief which sourly robs from me. The American Civil War used to be characterized as brother against brother. Plainly, a sexual adventure has so disturbed the relationship between older and younger man that each is at war not only against the mirror self, but in the poet's case, in my love and hate, against himself where, dual as always, he acts as an accessory to that same sweet passion which so sourly robs him of the uncarnal love that had reigned before.
No more be grieved at that which thou hast done. Roses have thorns and silver fountains mud. Clouds and eclipses stain both moon and sun, and loathsome canker lives in sweetest bud. All men make faults, and even I in this, authorizing thy trespass with compare, myself corrupting, salving thy amiss, excusing thy sins more than thy sins are. For to thy sensual fault I bring in sense. Thy adverse party is thy advocate, and 'gainst myself a lawful plea commence. Such civil war is in my love and hate, that I an accessory needs must be to that sweet thief which sourly robs from me. What is your substance? Whereof are you made, that millions of strange shadows on you tend? Since every one hath every one shade, and you, but one, can every shadow lend. Describe Adonis, and the counterfeit is poorly imitated after you. On Helen's cheek all art of beauty set, and you in Grecian tires are painted new. Speak of the spring and foison of the year. The one doth shadow of your beauty show, the other as your bounty doth appear. And you in every blessed shape we know. In all external grace you have some part, but you like none you, for constant heart.
A poem, it's been said, of abundant flattery, but a poem, I imagine, not displeasing to the young Earl of Southampton, to whom it was probably addressed. Shakespeare had earlier compared him to a summer's day. Now, for good measure, he tells him he combines the promise of spring and the bounty of autumn, the manly grace of Adonis and the womanly beauty of Helen. What a piece of work he must have been. Yes, what a piece of work. We've heard the poem read as if Shakespeare meant it only as a simple tribute to his friend. But there's not much in Shakespeare's sonnets that's simple, and scarcely a line which is only what it seems. He's clever, Shakespeare, and he expects us to be clever too. In the very first phrases, he hints at a rather more subtle interpretation of the poem. What is your substance? Whereof are you made that millions of strange shadows on you tend? Substance and shadow. The reference is almost certainly to a famous parable by Plato, the story of the cave. Imagine we're in a cave with a great fire burning behind us, whose light casts on the wall our shadows and the shadows of everything else around us. We're chained there, facing the wall, unable to look round. We see those dancing shadows. We see life passing in outline before our eyes, but we've no knowledge whatever of the solid reality which lies behind. And so, like a child whose only experience of the world comes through watching a television screen, we come to believe that the shadows themselves are the real thing. Our problem, Plato implies, is to recognize that beneath the surface of appearances there may exist another level of reality, that things may have an inner substance to them which is never wholly revealed. We see a thing now in this light, now in that. We hear a poem read, now with this emphasis, now with that. But every example which reaches our senses is at best an ephemeral and patchy copy, a shadow, and one shadow only, of the transcendental reality that lies behind. Everything and everyone hath every one shade, and none can express all aspects of itself at once. Except, it seems, for Shakespeare's friend, a being who, contrary both to philosophy and natural law, can every shadow lend. A man seen by the light of 100 different fires, a poem read in 100 different ways at once, a shocking new form of a man, as if among the cut-out portraits, the flat silhouettes which line our shadow theatre wall, we were suddenly to come across a cubist painting, a portrait by Picasso or by Braque. Early this century, the cubist painters, rising as it were to Plato's challenge, attempted quite deliberately to overcome the limitations of a single point of view. They took, say, a familiar object, a guitar, broke it apart, and portrayed it on the canvas as if it were being seen from many different sides at once. Calculatedly lending to the object every shadow, they hoped that the essence, the inner substance of the object would shine through. They took a human face and did the same. But theirs was only the most literal, perhaps the most brutal attempt to break the chains of Plato's cave. If the Cubist painters knew the problem, Leonardo da Vinci knew it too. If the Cubist painters solved it by superimposing several different images, so in another sense did Leonardo. 100 shadows may tend upon Braque's Lady with Guitar. 1,000,000 then tend upon the Mona Lisa. All the thoughts and experience of the world are etched and molded there. The words now of the critic Walter Peters. The animalism of Greece, the lust of Rome. She is older than the rocks amongst which she sits. Like the vampire, she has been dead many times and learned the secrets of the grave, and has been a diver in deep seas and keeps their fallen days about her, and trafficked for strange webs with Eastern merchants. Leonardo, with his painting of the Mona Lisa, gives us a picture of someone with the charismatic power to represent all ways of existing to all men. And Shakespeare, with his poem to an Elizabethan youth, tells us of just such another one, and tells us, in the other poems, that he is in love with him. Alas, poor Shakespeare, to love and to ask for love from such a complicated being, or rather such a complicated nest of different beings, is as foolish as to try and play a simple serenade on Braque's guitar. Such charismatic prodigies, the Mona Lisa, Shakespeare's friend, in our own time, Nijinsky, Greta Garbo, Marilyn Monroe, may have an almost magical attraction. But the spell they exert is the spell which Stanislavski called stage charm. By face, by manner, By voice and personality, they hint at every possible existence, but never do they finally confirm or deny a single one of them. All things to all people, but never at last the capacity to be any particular thing to anyone. Such men, such women too, of course, are dangerous. So dangerous that Plato himself, in describing his ideal republic, recommended that we ban them from the city gates. And if Shakespeare knew Plato's story of the cave, he also very likely knew of Plato's warning. If any such man, Plato says, if any such man who has the skill to transform himself into all sorts of characters and represent all sorts of things, shall come to us to show us his art, we shall kneel down before him as a rare and holy and delectable being. But we shall tell him that he and his kind have no place in our city. Shakespeare, in the other sonnets, chides, rails, complains against his friend, but at no time has he the courage to send the man away. Yet Shakespeare knew none better the trouble he was in. The poem, in its other meaning, is never a poem of abundant flattery. It's a lament.
What is your substance? Whereof are you made, that millions of strange shadows on you tend? Since every one hath every one shade, and you but one can every shadow lend. Describe Adonis, and the counterfeit is poorly imitated after you. On Helen's cheek all art of beauty set, and you in Grecian tires are painted new. Speak of the spring and foison of the year. The one doth shadow of your beauty show, the other as your bounty doth appear, and you in every blessed shape we know. In all external grace you have some part, but like you none you, for constant